Hi friends, welcome to Comics Odyssey once again. Today we're going to look at Chapter 4 of Understanding Comics. And it's all about time. Before we looked at the panel transitions and how they help move the action, the story along, and we did take a look at time briefly there by way of motions, and this is going to come up again. So time in comics, the way comics, the medium, deals with time, is one way that it's unique from other mediums. So a panel of time, a panel is essentially one moment of time, but that's a bit tricky, right? Because within a panel you can have time moving. So it really isn't a exact science. Like one panel is, 0.034 seconds. Like in film, each panel is a frozen moment of time, and the images must flow quickly from one to the other in order to represent motion. But here we have an example of a panel where a lot of time passes, right? We have a party scene and a photograph is being taken, they're talking, all those dialogue balloons take a certain amount of time for the characters to speak. A couple of chess moves are made, a bit of an argument happens, a picture is taken. One panel, a lot of time. But the argument could be made, well, this is actually multiple panels and could be split up like this, right? One action, another action, but still the dialogue takes time for the characters to speak. If you notice in action comics, in superhero and action adventure comics, the characters will also often deliver pretty substantial pieces of dialogue while they're in midair jumping onto a guy, right? And conceivably, by the time they've finished saying that piece of dialogue, they would have covered the distance between where they're jumping from to where they're jumping to. So the time in comics is not an exact science. It's much more an intuitive thing. Even if you break this party scene into several panels, one panel, even if it's just a small amount of time, like the time it takes for the camera shutter button to be pressed and the flash to go off and the guy to say smile, that's not instantaneous. It's not a single moment of time. And comics can play with this time thing a lot. There's also the assumption that time moves in a single line from left to right, top to bottom. But we'll see examples of how that's not the case, right? Here's an example of what we talked about a little bit earlier. This could be said to be a frozen moment in time, right? Because there's no indication of motion. There's implication of motion, but this specific image is a single frozen moment in time. But when you hear an announcer, a word balloon that implies an announcer commentating on the action, then all of a sudden the image, the exact same image, moves. Time is introduced because sound implies time. Sound requires time to be heard, which is it gets pretty metaphysical pretty quickly when you think about it. So he's talking about how the panel is essentially the indicator of time, but it's also an indicator of time and space, because in comics, because there's no actual motion, only implied motion, or perhaps mentally perceived motion, in order for time to exist, it must communicate the passage of time through space. There's some discussion here about how time can be compressed or decompressed. For instance, this simple story here of two guys speaking, placing a single panel between the two moments of dialogue implies a pause. So he's talking about how do you control the length of the pause? So you could add several more panels, right? But he's saying, what about increasing the size of the distance between panels? Does that make the pause seem longer? Well, if you're consistently, which you should as a comics creator, have the same amount of space between panels, on an 11 by 17 sheet, the standard is 1/4 inch between panels. When you suddenly increase the size between panels, like double it, like here, it calls attention to the gutter, which implies something, at least, and he's making the case implies the passage of time. He said, what about changing the size of the panel? So there's all sorts of options available to comics artists to indicate the passage of time, not just panel by panel, but distance between panels, shape of panel. Perhaps this could be made a borderless panel, like here, which indicates, or like here, right? You're breaking up, so it's not contained, so there's an implication of a change in perhaps how time is perceived by the character or characters, right? Here we have the borderless panel. So there's a sense of timelessness, especially with the subject having no motion depicted, only implied motion, which is the falling of rain. So all things to think about in terms of how we read comics and especially how we make them. There is some say over the pacing of time and how comics are, the time in comics is perceived. So again, we see Scott McCloud's temperament here of pointing towards possibility. So he's talking about how the idea that the reader might choose a direction to read is considered exotic still. And I think it will continue to be, especially in this format. There's just so much cultural entanglement of the format of the book and the page turn and left to right, top to bottom, that the choosing of direction must be made explicitly clear in like an experiment. And I'll show you one of those. This is a book called Meanwhile by Jason Shiga. I had the pleasure of being able to speak with Mr. Shiga when I was working at a different comic website. This is like a comic that experiments with the medium and the passage of time. And Jason Shiga has kind of made a name for himself as a comics experimenter. Really good book to get for kids. It's sturdily built, and the reason is that there's a lot of page turning. The idea here is that you start from the opening panel and you start reading the story, and these little tubes direct your eye. Okay. And finally, you get a choice. Okay. If you choose chocolate ice cream, the tube directs your eye to this tab here. So you turn to the chocolate ice cream choice, and the tube directs you to read this panel, and it continues to direct you to various parts of the book. So it's a choose your own adventure comic book, right? So you chose the chocolate, and because you chose chocolate, you get led to a certain portion of the story. But when you read that part of the story, you get faced with another choice, yet another choice, which can lead you to a different part of the story and a different story. So mathematically, he claims that there are 3,856 story possibilities. So it's an interesting experiment, and it's actually fun to do with kids, because they like the whole ice cream thing, and the artwork is, appealing to them, and they like to be able to pick whatever they want to pick. You could spend hours and hours just poking around in here, choosing different types of story outcomes. And because there's so many, you don't remember all of them, right? So here's a possible ending. There's different possible endings. And of course, the whole thing kind of represents the entire chunk of time and how you can move back and forth within it. And the premise of the story plays on that too, because it's based on the quantum mechanics interpretation of reality, like the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where all the possible realities exist simultaneously, and your choices dictate which reality you are entering. So, really interesting project. Meanwhile, by Jason Shiga. Pretty interesting stuff. I recommend it. So this is part of what's interesting about comics, is that each panel represents the present, even though it's not typically a single slice of time, like timeless time, like no motion implied. Mostly that there is some time that passes within the panel. So each panel has a past, present, and future, but represents the present. But the panel after represents the future, and the panel before represents the past. But as a reader, you can, at a glance, see all of those times. Whereas if you're watching a film, you have to wait for the passage of time in order to experience the passage of time. Whereas I can turn this page, right, like this sequence, I can see the entire sequence at a glance. But I read, right, I can follow the passage of time. So there's a very unusual relationship to how time passes. Again, Scott McCloud points to the world of possibility, how the panels are laid out in the presentation, the format can affect how we read the story. Here we have a kind of a circular story that doesn't end. You can read it back and forth, which provides a different story experience. So in history, he discusses how motion became quite a hot topic when photography came about, and the concept of moving pictures was just around the corner, but not invented yet, and there was a lot of competition. This is where film comes from. The idea that film is essentially photography that you look at very fast. So at the time, there were painters who kind of got on that bandwagon of motion and time depicted visually, and made experiments on how to. They were making the claim that we can express the movement of time in a single image. And we have Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. You can look it up. That kind of art movement was sort of abandoned, but in comics, because comics is story medium and requires the implication of passage of time, the depiction of motion through time became an important topic, and people started experimenting. Here we have Duchamp's ultimate statement on how to depict motion through a single image, and we do have kind of a comic booky thing here, like a cartooned expression of time. We're discussing here the evolution of the motion line, where it started. They were called zip ribbons, and they were quite erratic, and eventually that technique got stylized, and you could say its peak form exists in the American superhero comics genre, a la Jack Kirby kind of thing. And that's become standard practice, where the motion line almost has its own physicality. It overlaps other like background elements and figures, and the motion line itself becomes almost like an object within the scene. There's different types. He's talking about how Gene Colan was a film buff, and he knew about photography blurring, so he experimented with blur effects. Of course, in the Flash comics, we see these effects a lot because the character is all about motion and time, right? So we see tons of these blur effects. The artist here more or less sticks to the one type of effect, which is made up of lines, because it works and it's effective, right? Just different types of motion lines, and tons of them to really express. It draws attention to itself and really expresses speed and motion. Fun to look at. I believe the artist is Carmine Infantino. He's talking about how American comics didn't kind of evolved in a certain way, and mostly. Well, let's look at how the Japanese manga artists, how they differed. They became interested in what McCloud calls subjective motion. The idea was that if spectating the speed of a character, like in The Flash, if that's exciting and immersive, then being that character, it would be even more exciting and immersive. So they kind of place the camera with the subject in motion, and instead that means that if the camera's following the object or the subject that's in motion, that the rest of the scene is going to blur out, and we see examples of this here. So here the road is blurring out, so the camera's following, it's kind of staying on the motorcycles here as well, even more so because you're in the driver's seat of the motorcycle, and it gives the impression that you're in the action, right? Which I think is a really cool effect. Discussion of the polyptych, a single scene cut into several panels with a character moving across it, which gives the impression of the character moving across the scene without having to draw the scene over and over and over. It's a very cool effect. Single background, single subject, but the subject repeats and is taking different actions. There's a little point I wanted to make here. He says, the natural world creates great beauty every day, yet the only rules of composition it follows are those of function and chance. And here's a point of disagreement I have with Mr. McCloud, is that if the natural world is creating great beauty all the time, then doesn't it naturally follow that the rule of composition that nature follows is the rule of beauty, right? To me, that's makes sense. So again, he's discussing how he's constantly, especially in his book Making Comics, he's constantly pointing to, yes, we can deconstruct the comics mediums and these different aspects of the medium into their component parts and analyze them, but ultimately, for most of us, unless we're specifically trying to innovate on the medium and make that innovation bare and visible to the reader, if we're just trying to tell our stories, you don't want to call attention too much to these time strangenesses. You want to basically do it intuitively. And for the most part, especially after having read this, if you just go with your instincts, for the most part, you'll get it right. Right? There's always some refinement that needs to happen, but if you're a person who's read comics a lot, you'll be able to do the thing. But it's good to know all the different techniques that exist out there and kind of look at what different people are doing. Personally, I like these sorts of blur effects. I think they're super cool, very versatile, and I just the texture of these lines, I just find them enjoyable to look at. How these lines create texture, they're just nice to look at. I love lines, I guess. All right, so that's the chapter on time. I'm going to be on vacation for a week. I should be back in time to do chapter 5 next Wednesday, where it's all about line and what different types of line, how they affect the reading experience and what you're trying to express on the page. Really interesting stuff. So if there are comments, questions on this on my Substack, I'm probably not going to see them until next week because I'll be away. So best of luck with everything. If you would be so kind as to subscribe, like, restack, all that stuff, that'll help me out. I'll see you next time. God bless.